It seems like every year or so you hear about a new threat to YouTube. Sometimes it's a hot new streaming site that's gonna take all of YouTube's viewers. And every single time, YouTube wins out. Sometimes it's a YouTuber who's gonna ruin the culture of YouTube and endanger children and force all the advertisers to pull their funding. And every single time, that YouTuber winds up irrelevant and forgotten a few years down the line. Sometimes the big threat to YouTube is the government and the FCC and net neutrality and Article 13 and SOPA and PIPA. And every single time, nothing really changes and YouTube pretty much stays the same. Sometimes it seems like YouTube is its own biggest threat. And whatever new bonehead policy they're rolling out is gonna drive away all the creators and viewers, and every single time, people complain for a bit, YouTubers adapt, and everyone just keeps watching YouTube. It seems like YouTube is really good at dealing with threats, which is part of the reason why I firmly believe that this site will be around for longer than any of these other ones. But what was the biggest threat in the history of YouTube? Was there ever any force or event in the history of YouTube.com that seriously threatened the existence of the entire website? Well, I'm here to say that such an event did happen. And it was caused by the most ancient primordial enemy in all of YouTube lore. A name that will send shivers down the spines of the oldest creators on this website. On March 13th, 2007, Viacom International Inc. filed a lawsuit against YouTube seeking damages for a site-wide case of copyright infringement. The price? $1 billion.
You know, Bob, a company
is like an enormous clock.
Yes, precisely. It only works if all the little cogs mesh together.
I'm being metaphorical, Bob. You know what I mean by cooperative cogs?
Viacom is the smallest major television media company in the United States. And much as is the case with dogs, the smallest ones are usually the nastiest. While some companies like Disney or NBC at least make an attempt to portray themselves as fun or cool or having a basic semblance of human emotion, Viacom doesn't bother with any of that. They don't beat around the bush about being a cold, sterile, ruthless corporate entity. But hey, at least they're honest. Viacom doesn't have the immense capital or brand recognition to screw around with a phony PR campaign about how great they are. Like I said, they're the smallest major television corporation in the US. And it's not easy being small. Well, as small as a multi-billion-dollar media conglomerate can be. But anyway, being the smallest part of any group makes you the most vulnerable target. Heck, Viacom has spent almost half of its history merging in and out of existence with CBS. Like any company, Viacom would certainly like to grow bigger, but it's not as easy for them as a company like Disney that can just coast off of the revenue from the gargantuan amount of stuff they own and use that revenue to buy even more stuff. Viacom doesn't exactly have the same liberty. They can't afford to take as many risks. When they find something that makes money, they have to cling onto it for dear life. And most importantly, when they find an opportunity, they have to seize it hard. In 2007, Viacom was less than 2 years removed from splitting off of CBS. The company was at its most vulnerable point in more than a decade. And when Viacom realized that an unknown Silicon Valley startup called YouTube had potentially infringed their copyright, they knew it was time to strike. Viacom claimed that YouTube had committed brazen copyright infringement from over 150,000 clips of Viacom TV shows, accruing over 1.5 billion views in total, leading Viacom to demand $1 billion in damages. Where did they get $1 billion from? I don't know. $1 billion certainly does not represent the ad revenue that you could potentially earn from 1.5 billion views. And on top of that, this was 2007 when online ad rates were much lower than they are today. Perhaps Viacom was factoring in the potential lost DVD sales or something. It doesn't really matter, and it doesn't have to make sense either. The point is that $1 billion is a scary amount of money to lose, even for a tech giant like Google. YouTube actually had something in common with Viacom, since they too had recently undergone their own change in ownership. Many modern-day critics of YouTube's practices like to point to this event as the moment YouTube died. when realistically the exact opposite is true. In the first 2 years of YouTube's existence, the site's exponential growth in traffic left its founders struggling with mounting costs and legal problems. Even today, it is still unclear whether or not YouTube is actually profitable. Like it or not, Google purchasing YouTube was completely necessary for the site to stay alive, and it was especially necessary for combating one of the biggest lawsuits in the history of the internet. A legal defeat would have started a catastrophic chain of events for YouTube. Not only would it result in a massive financial loss, it would open the door for every other media company to demand their own compensation for copyright damages. YouTube would have been financially gutted, and Google would have most likely been forced to do what they do with all of their failed ventures: abandon the site entirely. Beyond that, the legal precedent of this case had the potential to drastically restrict the nature of copyrighted material on the entire web. Imagine a version of the internet where a website like YouTube could not exist due to fear of legal extermination in the event that someone uploads any clip from a TV show. These were the stakes of the lawsuit, and the tremendous implications of this legal case rested on the shoulders of the Honorable Judge Louis Stanton. The key legal issue of this case was the following. Viacom claimed that YouTube violated copyright law by allowing its users to upload their content without permission. YouTube did not dispute that. I mean, come on. They were everywhere. There was no getting around the fact that a boatload of Viacom-owned videos were uploaded to YouTube. YouTube's defense was that the DMCA's safe harbor provision exempted them from liability. So what is the DMCA, besides that scary looking thing that's listed whenever your YouTube videos get copyright claimed? Well, the DMCA is an American copyright law that directly influences the copyright policy on practically every major website. When your YouTube video gets taken down by a copyright claim, that is the result of YouTube complying with the DMCA. Since nearly every major website is based out of the United States, they must comply with the DMCA in order to legally operate. Within the DMCA is a provision called OSCILA that protects online service providers like Google and YouTube from being held liable for copyright violations on their platform. This provision is otherwise known as the DMCA safe harbor, and in the Viacom lawsuit, YouTube had to argue that they qualified for safe harbor protection. In order to qualify for safe harbor protection, an online service provider must meet 5 requirements. In order to win this case, YouTube would have to prove that they had no idea what was going on their website. This tangent would serve as the crux for the whole lawsuit. The subsequent legal battle would churn on for years, but the consequences of the lawsuit became known almost immediately. YouTube quickly scrambled to implement their Content ID system.
So how can copyright holders identify these uses of their content on YouTube, control them, and even take advantage of these new forms of user distribution? The answer is Content ID, a system we've built that gives copyright holders choices about whether and how their content is shown on YouTube.
This system is still around on YouTube today, and it allows media companies to register their copyrighted material on a database that gets used to check and claim new uploads for copyright infringement. Of course, when Content ID first debuted, it went haywire with taking down videos and terminating YouTube channels. For comparison, it was executed about as well as the demonetization system from last year. So make of that what you will. As a former YouTube pooper, just thinking about this era gives me Vietnam-like flashbacks. Ironically, in YouTube's quest to establish their own safe harbor, they had completely neglected another safe harbor provision in fair use. It would be many years in the future before YouTube would even attempt to reconcile that issue, but it didn't matter. Nothing about fair use or unfair takedowns mattered at this point. YouTube had to win this lawsuit, or else they may not have had a future at all.
Court.
Funding for YouTube Geographic is provided by NordVPN. Contributions from patrons like Babaloo Productions, Probuscus, LGBTQIA, Nuo Dunkel, Etienne Senpai, I can't believe I have to read this dumb name out loud. Spiny Puffles, Felix Gomez, Dat Simple Nope, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
I have 10 high-priced lawyers.
Viacom.
The next major proceeding in the case came in July 2008 when Judge Stanton ordered YouTube to hand over the private viewing data of every user who had ever visited the site. Viacom required the data to search for evidence of YouTube knowingly benefiting from the copyrighted material. YouTube argued that their users' data was protected under the Video Privacy Protection Act of 1988. Judge Stanton overruled this claim, however, because YouTube was not a videotape service provider. Looking at it today, this statement may seem completely ridiculous, but you have to remember that back in 2008, the internet wasn't nearly as pervasive as it is today. Most Americans had only just gained access to broadband internet. Internet speeds had only just become fast enough for average users to reliably stream online video. Most computers still look like this. The original iPhone was only a year old, and it would be 3 years before the majority of Americans would even own a smartphone. Twitter was just 2 years old, Spotify came out that year, Bitcoin and Google Docs were a year away, Instagram was 2 years away, and Snapchat was 3 years away. Needless to say, the internet was a very different place 10 years ago, and many people still saw it as a gimmick rather than a staple of everyday life.
Stupid.
It's likely that when Judge Stanton made this ruling, he perceived YouTube as much closer to LimeWire than to television. Naturally, the prospect of Viacom commandeering the private data from millions of users sparked outrage among YouTubers and digital rights groups.
Apparently, when Viacom is not killing the unborn and clubbing baby seals, they just want to get to know us a little more.
They're going to look at every single bit of data that YouTube has gathered, and that means every video that you ever watched on YouTube.
It just really sucks that one huge conglomerate can set legal precedent which says, hey, yeah, it's okay for a company to get all of your private information if they ask for it.
Finally, here are the companies that Viacom owns that need to be boycotted immediately. Companies like Viacom are betting that you will not stand up to them, so here's your chance to prove them wrong.
It was one of the first events in the history of YouTube that truly galvanized a call to action from all corners of the site, and it was one of the first times YouTubers ever felt that they were part of a community. Thankfully, Viacom gave into the backlash and agreed to allow Google to anonymize the data before handing it over. Internet users could now breathe easy as a massive breach in privacy had been averted.
Oh, man!
Curiously, within the next decade, Google would begin to see the value in the very same user data they sought to protect from the Viacom lawsuit, and they began cultivating user data on an unprecedented scale. What are they doing with this data? Who knows? Certainly not anything bad, right?
We interrupt this program to bring you read education.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
You
here.
can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man to death. You hear him hollering? He's
I
dying.
said before, the shocks may be painful, but they're not
but
dangerous.
They're hollering. He can't stand it. What if something happens to him?
The experiment requires that you continue.
300 volts.
They let you keep the piece of brain they cut out.
Well anyway, the point is that in 2008, YouTube users managed to keep their privacy, but not YouTube employees. And Viacom would use the internal emails of YouTube employees as damning evidence of YouTube knowingly allowing copyrighted content to thrive on their platform. YouTube's whole case was falling apart. Viacom could have made a compelling argument that YouTube failed to meet a single requirement for safe harbor protection from copyright infringement. And I truly believe that Viacom would have won this case if it weren't for one little mistake. In a stupendously idiotic blunder, Viacom had actually uploaded their own shows to YouTube in the months prior to the suit as part of a guerrilla marketing campaign. Now these weren't official clips on an official Viacom endorsed YouTube channel. These videos were deliberately disguised as unauthorized leaks by no-name users, attempting to emulate the authentic YouTube experience. According to YouTube's chief legal counsel, Zahava Levine, Viacom hired no fewer than 18 marketing agencies to upload their TV shows to the site. They purposely roughed up the videos to give them the appearance of stolen content. They even allegedly had their employees walk across the street to Kinko's and upload the videos there so that they could not be traced back to Viacom. Why would Viacom do this? I have no idea. Something about appealing to millennials, I guess. It still baffles me why any company would go so far to steal their own content. But apparently this tactic worked so well that not even Viacom's own employees could keep track of which videos were uploaded from their own discretion and which were actually stolen. When proposed with the idea of removing some popular clips from The Daily Show and The Colbert Report, the president of Comedy Central reportedly advised the network to leave the clips up on YouTube. Viacom's internal departments had completely mixed directives on whether they wanted to remove infringing YouTube videos of their TV shows. Sometimes they would demand that YouTube remove a stolen clip, only to realize that it was one of their own authorized fake stolen clips, and then request that YouTube reinstate the clip. This totally absurd and confusing series of events ultimately led to Viacom suing YouTube for copyright infringement on content which included videos that Viacom themselves had uploaded. Viacom had YouTube on the ropes, but this one mistake allowed YouTube to activate their trap card.
Loophole!
Since Viacom themselves could not keep track of which of their TV clips were uploaded with permission, it was therefore unreasonable to expect YouTube to accurately know which videos to remove. YouTube could prove that they had no knowledge of the infringing material because it was impossible to determine which videos were truly infringing. Viacom's whole lawsuit came crumbling down because of a technicality. It may seem like a silly deus ex machina for one of the most important cases in internet history, but personally, I couldn't think of a more fitting end for a company like Viacom. Their status as the smallest major American television company forced them into a mentality of penny pinching and corner cutting. They were too cheap to run an actual marketing campaign on the internet, so they did the next best thing, using a flashy new site called YouTube to promote their shows for free. And even as YouTube complied with all of their requests, Viacom still wanted more. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too. Viacom took advantage of YouTube for months of free promotion, then they tried to rob them for everything they had. Little did Viacom know, their own suffocating corporate structure would trip them up and ultimately lead to their defeat. On June 23, 2010, Judge Stanton ruled in favor of YouTube, holding that the website did operate within the DMCA safe harbor provision. Viacom's blunder became the determining factor in Stanton's decision. Who knows, maybe in an alternate universe, Viacom didn't make the same mistake, and you all would be watching this on DailyMotion right now. It came really close to happening too. If only Viacom had been a little less brazen.
Bailiffs, place the mayor under arrest.
What? Oh, yes. All that stuff I did.
Boy, I really hope somebody got fired for that blunder.
Of course, the story doesn't end here. Viacom wasn't satisfied with losing out on a billion-dollar payday because of a technicality. They immediately appealed the decision, stressing how YouTube at one time knowingly ignored copyrighted content in order to grow their user base. Luckily for YouTube, the sluggish speed of the legal system compared to the rapid growth of the internet helped ensure their survival. The appellate court did not reach a decision until April 2012, where they determined that a reasonable jury could have found YouTube guilty of knowingly hosting infringing content, and sent the case back down to the district court for further judgment. Even though this reopened the threat for YouTube, the site had transformed into a very different place from how it was way back in 2007 at the beginning of the lawsuit. During the 5 years Viacom spent butting heads with YouTube in court, other media companies began seeing more value in cooperating with YouTube instead. In November 2008, YouTube reached a deal with CBS, MGM, and Lionsgate to make full-length movies and TV shows available to rent on the platform. In 2009, practically the entire American music industry partnered with YouTube by syndicating industry music videos through Vivo. From 2006 to 2012, YouTube's monthly active users had grown from 20 million to 800 million. YouTube was no longer just a trendy, gimmicky tech startup. They were now a dominant force in the future of entertainment. YouTube began as just another checkers piece, and they wound up becoming the chessboard. Other media companies had to respect YouTube, or risk losing everything when people eventually stopped playing checkers. That's why by 2012, there was never really any concern that this once daunting lawsuit would threaten YouTube anymore. The paradigm had simply shifted in YouTube's favor, and for this reason, it should be no surprise why in 2013, Judge Stanton ruled in favor of YouTube on all 4 issues in the case. A clear and decisive victory for not just YouTube, but the video streaming rights of the internet as a whole. Viacom, in their unending hubris, refused to concede defeat and filed yet another appeal, but eventually reality caught up with them. In March 2014, 7 years after the beginning of the lawsuit, Viacom and YouTube settled the case out of court, where no money reportedly changed hands. Viacom was originally seeking $1 billion from YouTube. They ended up getting nothing. Today you can find basically any movie or TV show available to buy or rent on YouTube, even ones from Viacom, although I've never known anyone who actually pays for these. You can probably find the same shows for free on one of those bootleg 24/7 live streams. Ironically, these streams could probably give companies like Viacom the grounds to sue YouTube yet again, but I don't see that happening. Like I said earlier, YouTube is now the chessboard, and Viacom has been relegated to a pawn occupying their space. We've reached a point in time when a lot of people are quitting checkers, and Viacom is now compelled to remain in YouTube's good graces. The television media companies of old have been forced to work with YouTube, and you can see the effects of this just about everywhere. Whereas in the old days of YouTube, copyright violations would just get your videos taken down and your channels striked, copyright claimants today are more than happy to keep your video online just as long as they can earn revenue from it. The YouTube game is always changing, and that's part of the reason I find it so fun. YouTube always has some major conflict going on, and there's always something to complain about. When I was starting out on this website, the Content ID system was terrible, unfair, and broken. Now, it's the demonetization system. It's easy to look at all of YouTube's problems and lament how the people running this site have no idea what's going on their platform, but it's important to remember that legally, they can't. All of the frustrating automation and algorithms and AI exists so that YouTube can continue to exist. Because if the people working at YouTube officially knew about some of the sketchy stuff on this website, then they probably couldn't be allowed to run it. When it comes to running YouTube, ignorance is not just a hallmark, it's a necessity. In February 2018, representing a total reversal of their prior legal war, Viacom finalized a deal to acquire VidCon, the most coveted YouTube convention in the world. The biggest threat in YouTube's history ended up becoming just another business partner. I guess that's just the way things are in the corporate era of YouTube. But hey, it's just business. And you know how the old saying goes, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So this video is probably a lot for you guys to take in. Even though it's easy to stand in awe watching 2 giant corporate monsters slug it out, it can also leave you feeling powerless to do anything about it. Viacom alone was willing to jeopardize the rights of millions of YouTubers just for some extra money to expand their profit margins. And if you thought that was bad, the European Union is trying to do the same thing by banning memes across an entire continent. When monstrous entities as big as the EU and Viacom and Google start brawling, it's easy for a bunch of us little guys to get stepped on in the process. So with that being said, what can you do to protect yourself from getting run over? Well, if this was 30 years ago, then you'd probably be out of luck. But thankfully, the rise of the internet has really helped level the playing field. Corporations and world governments have caught on to this, which is why they've spent much of the last decade trying to regulate, control, and censor everything they can. And that brings us to this video's sponsor, NordVPN. Mark Zuckerberg and Susan Wojcicki are making out right now on a pile of money that they got from selling your information to shady companies who want to spam you with Minions ads. Using a VPN will help make it harder for massive tech companies to leech off of your personal data. Any of you out there right now browsing the web completely unprotected are basically giving ruthless tech CEOs free money. So how about getting yourself a nice slice of NordVPN and demonetizing Susan for a change? And don't think I've forgotten about you poor saps over there in Europe. Your corrupt legion of unelected bureaucrats are trying to ban everyone from everything. Let's not kid ourselves here. Article 13 is gonna pass, because when has the EU ever done anything to help Europeans? It's not gonna do anything to YouTube because nothing ever does. So naturally, that just leaves you Europeans to bear the full brunt of your government's bad ideas. So don't let your government tell you what memes you can and can't share. Use NordVPN to relocate your IP address to a country that's not completely spineless. Take back control of your web browsing and experience the internet as it was intended. Defend yourself today by visiting nordvpn.com/EmpLemon, where you can get access to all of these features for just a small monthly fee. But can you really put a price on freedom? Yes, you can, and that price is $12 a month. But through this special offer, you can use the code EmpLemon to get NordVPN for just $2.99 a month. They'll even throw in an extra month absolutely free. So visit nordvpn.com right now and stop giving Susan's jet ski free money. Give me free money instead by clicking the link in the description and purchasing the product so that this ad performs well and more companies want to sponsor me. You should also do it for all that stuff I said earlier. Whatever. Go buy yourself some Nord. It's like putting a condom on your internet.